Welcome back, third grade friends. We are going to continue reading Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball, and we are ready for Chapter 7, The True Story of the Wee Folk. Long ago, leprechauns could be found throughout the world, Howie's grandmother began. The leprechaun emperor ruled the lands by possession of the stolen fairy stone. There are many kinds of magic stones: red, blue, and even purple. But the most powerful one of all is the fairy stone. It holds a strong magic, the stone does, so powerful that the leprechauns became a nuisance with it. They traveled the world tricking anyone they could. What was the stone like? Melody asked. The fairy stone is as green as the grass underfoot and the trees overhead, and the leprechauns were proud to have it. The emperor wore it at the throat of his scarlet robe. Scarlet, Eddie nearly shouted. But that's red. Everybody knows leprechauns wear green. Howie's grandmother shook her head. Not in those long ago times. They only began to wear green when they went into hiding. Why did they go into hiding? Howie asked. 'Twas the vault of the vampires. The vampires! All four kids yelled at once. Aye, Howie's grandmother nodded seriously. The vampires grew tired of the leprechaun's tricky ways, so they decided to get the fairy stone away from the wee folk. What happened? Melody asked. How did the vampires get the fairy stone from the leprechauns? They were tricked, Howie's grandmother exclaimed. The vampires sent a spy to live in the emperor's castle. The spy gained their trust and then sneaked into the emperor's bedroom, taking the fairy stone whilst he slept. But that's stealing, Liza cried. Howie's grandmother shook her head. The truth of the matter is that the fairy stone rightfully belonged to the vampires, and once they got it back, the vampires banished all leprechauns to the Emerald Isle. 'Tis then that leprechauns began to wear green and to hide amongst the trees and bushes. Some say it was because of shame, and to this day, most leprechauns of Ireland are too ashamed to look at you. Some say you can control a leprechaun if you get him to look in your eyes. But didn't the leprechauns try to get the stone back? Eddie asked. Aye, and they're still a trying to this day, Howie's grandmother said. But 'tis only 3 days that the leprechauns can be a missing from the Emerald Isle. 1 day for each leaflet of the shamrock. The vampires saw fit to punish them that way. Was it Count Dracula who got the stone back for the vampires? Eddie asked. Is that who the emperor trusted? Howie's grandmother looked at each of them and then she answered in a whisper. 'Twas a teacher that tricked the emperor, the teacher of his very own children. The children were silent as they left the room. Out on the front porch, Howie whispered, That's it. What? Eddie asked. Didn't you hear what my grandmother said? A vampire who just happens to be a teacher stole the fairy stone from the leprechauns. So, Melody shrugged. So the vampire teacher is Mrs. Jeepers, Howie explained, and she stole the fairy stone. You know that weird green brooch she always wears? That's the magic stone. And I bet those stones in Mr. O'Grady's pouch are magic too. You don't know that, Melody insisted. We don't even know Mrs. Jeepers is a vampire. It does sort of fit together, Liza said thoughtfully. Of course it does, Howie nodded his head. That means Mr. O'Grady really is a leprechaun and he's come to get the stone back. That's just a fairy tale, Eddie disagreed. It's all a bunch of blarney. You won't think so if we have a leprechaun and a vampire war right in the halls of Bailey Elementary, Howie said seriously. All the kids were silent as they thought about what he said. If that's true, Melody whispered, we've got to do something to stop it. But what can we do? Howie asked. We're just a bunch of kids. Maybe we should tell our parents, Liza suggested. Nobody would believe us, Melody said. They'd think we'd gone completely bonkers. Well, we've got to think of something, Howie said, before it's too late. I know what I'm going to do, Eddie interrupted. I'll prove Mr. O'Grady isn't a leprechaun. Chapter 8, Master Trickster. I've got it, Eddie said the next morning as Howie, Melody, and Liza met under the oak tree. Got what? Melody giggled. Chicken pox? You should get a job with the circus. You're so funny, Eddie snapped. Go on, Howie urged. What were you going to say? I know how to prove Mr. O'Grady isn't a leprechaun, Eddie said. How? Liza asked. If he's a leprechaun, like you think, he'll be able to out-trick me, Eddie explained as he grabbed his book bag and headed inside. Wait! Melody yelled. It could be dangerous to make a leprechaun mad. But Eddie didn't listen to his friends as they followed him into the school. You don't know who you're dealing with, Howie pleaded. Mr. Potato Head doesn't know who he's dealing with, Eddie snapped as he hung up his jacket in the hallway. But he'll find out during gym class. Melody, Liza, and Howie tried to talk to Eddie during class, but Mrs. Jeepers flashed her eyes to silence them. For once, Eddie didn't mind. Just before gym, Eddie raised his hand. Yes, Mrs. Jeepers asked in her strange accent. May I be excused? Eddie asked as politely as he knew how. Mrs. Jeepers raised her eyebrows and looked hard at him, but then she slowly nodded her head. You must hurry. We will be ready to leave for physical education in less than 5 minutes. Eddie nodded and rushed out of the room. He got back just as the class was lining up. Nobody noticed that Eddie was wearing his jacket as he slipped into line between Howie and Liza. What are you going to do? Liza asked with concern. Eddie patted his bulging jacket pocket. I'm going to prove that I'm the master trickster. The third graders entered the gym. Mr. O'Grady was standing on the other side of the gym bouncing a basketball. He looked from face to face, but he didn't look in anybody's eyes. Top of the morning to ya, he called. Won't you be a-joining me for a little game of basketball? Eddie beat everybody to the other side of the gym and stood in front of Mr. O'Grady. The little man glanced at Eddie's raised hand. What would you be a-wantin'? Mr. O'Grady asked. Eddie looked at Howie and grinned before he answered Mr. O'Grady. Can we dance again today? I thought you would rather be a-shootin' hoops. Mr. O'Grady glanced around the gym. But 'twould be a pleasure to be teaching you another Irish jig. No, Eddie interrupted. I want to teach you a dance of ours. Mr. O'Grady touched the leather pouch hanging from his waistband and gently tugged on the string. And what might you be a-calling this dance? Eddie grinned as he pulled out a small jar from his pocket. It's called the Honeybee Waltz, he yelled as he unscrewed the lid, and it's guaranteed to keep you hopping. And with that, Eddie lightly rolled the jar toward Mr. O'Grady's feet. Carrie was the first to scream, Bees! Watch out for the bees! And then she ran out the door. The jar broke and the honeybees swarmed out and onto Mr. O'Grady's bright red sweatsuit. Watch out, Liza screamed. They'll sting you. But Mr. O'Grady didn't seem upset at all. Instead, he reached into his leather pouch and pulled out the small red stone. One by one, the bees flew away and out the open gym window. Wow, Howie yelled. How did you do that? To be sure, Mr. O'Grady chuckled, 'twas just a little bit of Irish luck, but since you like to dance so much, we'll have another jig tomorrow. Howie jabbed Eddie. So much for your honeybee waltz. Shut up, Eddie muttered as he plopped onto the bleachers. It was then that Eddie found out. Not all the honeybees had left. Ow! Eddie jumped up and grabbed his behind. I've been stung! Look, everyone, Melody yelled. Eddie's doing the honeybee waltz. All the kids laughed as Eddie raced out of the gym. In chapter 9, last chapter today, Eddie's War. Eddie wasn't surprised when Principal Davis called him to the office after school. Principal Davis looked like Humpty Dumpty with glasses as he frowned at Eddie. Sit down, young man, he said gruffly. Do I have to? Eddie whined. Principal Davis almost cracked a smile. Bees are dangerous. They're nothing to play around with. I know, Eddie muttered. I don't want to catch you misbehaving again, Principal Davis continued. Let this be a lesson to you. Tricks will get you in the end. Eddie rubbed his bee sting. I know, he said again as he left Principal Davis's office. His friends were waiting for him under the oak tree. Now, do you believe us? Melody said. Mr. O'Grady is the leprechaun after Mrs. Jeepers' fairy stone. Maybe we should just let him take it, Eddie grumbled. No, Liza shouted. Mr. O'Grady might hurt Mrs. Jeepers. Howie shook his head. Besides, if Mr. O'Grady got the stone, the world as we know it would end. Leprechauns would be running all over the place tricking people. Eddie wouldn't care, Melody told them. He's always playing tricks anyway. He'd never get the chance to play any more tricks, Howie said. The leprechauns would take care of that. Eddie rubbed his sore spot. You may have a point. We have to do something. But what? Melody cried. I have an idea, Howie said quietly. We have to do what my grandmother said. We've got to make him look us in the eyes. Then he'll do whatever we say. How? Liza squeaked. Mr. O'Grady doesn't ever look straight at us. Eddie interrupted. There's only one way. We have to trick the trickster. His three friends were quiet. How? Melody finally asked. You saw what he did when you tried to trick him this morning. Gather round, Eddie said, and I'll tell you. Liza's eyes grew big as Eddie whispered the plan. Do you think it'll work? She asked. It's got to, Howie said. Melody gulped. All right, let's do it. All right, we will finish the book tomorrow. I hope that you have been enjoying Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball.